Hello there and good afternoon. Welcome to London Travel Week Virtual. My name is Sam Martin from London Travel Week, and we're here today to talk about airlines, the most unprecedented crisis in its history. For that, we need an expert, and I am joined by WTM's answer to Professor Chris Whitty. It's John Strickland. John, first of all, how are you? Enjoying lockdown once again?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that comparison you made. I wouldn't really want to be compared to somebody of that ilk, but certainly the industry is one of those that's suffering because of its lockdown. I don't know about enjoying it, but at least I'm inside with a roof over my head on a fairly gloomy-looking London day today.
Exactly. Well, over the next hour, we're going to be providing you with updates on the aviation industry in this most unprecedented of years. Just a reminder for you, if you'd like to send some questions, we'll be coming towards those at the end of the webinar. So if you head to the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see an area where you can submit questions. And John, I'll pass the baton over to you and to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sam. Well, I hope you're all well wherever you happen to be in the world today. We're going to talk about the airline industry, and I remember doing a similar presentation back in the spring, a couple of months into this crisis, but things looked bad then. They certainly were. It wasn't possible to tell exactly how bad they were going to pan out. So unfortunately, the title is very much a reality. It is, I think, the most unprecedented crisis we've ever seen for the airline industry. I don't want to make it all about doom and gloom. Regrettably, that is indeed the environment we find ourselves in, but I want to explain it a little and try to give some pointers towards the future. And of course, very happy to take your questions as we go along. So let's kick off. I've got quite a lot to tell you about. First of all, looking at traffic data here on in, and to illustrate this, I've got a nice graph just published a few days ago by ACI, the International Airport Group, which shows that traffic, of course, fell off massively in April. And the consequence of that is, as we know, that most airlines were pretty well grounded and most aircraft not flying anywhere. Now, this graph does give a slightly illusory picture because it shows the traffic growing. There was some improvement as we moved into the summer, which I'll talk about again in a moment, but the reality is it's fallen away since this time. July, August time in Europe, for example, there was some recovery in leisure traffic to and from Mediterranean destinations from Northern Europe, and similarly, domestic markets around the world also saw some recovery. Indeed, they've perhaps been more buoyant than others. But the real tough nut to crack in terms of getting any recovery is the long-haul market. Long-haul effectively is doors closed at the present time. No long-haul flights to speak of are operating. As these figures show, traffic was down on international routes, primarily long-haul, by about 80% as of August. And the outlook, according to the industry body IATA, is still for a 90% reduction in traffic looking forward over the next few months. Some major markets that ordinarily would be flying hundreds of aircraft a day, such as the North Atlantic, are closed. It's perhaps hard to imagine that Europe to Asia, Australia to Europe are also completely closed in terms of normal passenger traffic at the present time. Now, the lack of traffic is partly in a reflection of customer confidence, which is all intertwined with government border closures and quarantines. A survey done by IATA back in September showed that a very small number of people were willing and confident to travel. Quite long time scales that people are looking for in the main before they're willing to take a flight again. So even those who have been traveling are very much in the minority currently. And that customer confidence means that it's extremely challenging for airlines to plan ahead. People are just very uncertain. If we look at these headlines from just yesterday in the UK press, at the weekend, the UK announced another lockdown is coming later this week. We heard France go into lockdown only a few days ago, and many other countries in the world are in lockdowns or certainly have border closures or quarantine periods extending to 2 weeks that are still applicable at the present time. And the consequence of that is people are not certain that they can book, or if they do book, will the flights they've reserved actually operate or not? All of that is also making it very difficult for airlines to know exactly what to schedule. You could say they're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. The normal data which airlines would rely on to make decisions about planning their long-term timetables, planning how to price the capacity they've offered, are not available. The data may as well be thrown in the dustbin currently. It doesn't really mean anything because none of the normal trends are actually applying. The only real clue could be bookings that are already held, but even they don't really mean much because bookings can be thrown away immediately as the quarantine comes in. But just searches that we see through social media and flight comparison websites provide some clue to airlines, at least where there is a level of interest. Just today, I heard Michael O'Leary of Ryanair saying in the media that when the Canary Islands were taken off the quarantine list for the UK, they saw a sudden surge of booking activity. I think he said they went from 2,000 to 28,000 bookings in the space of a few hours. So that's a little bit of hope that airlines have, but it doesn't guide very easily because normally bookings build up over a period of months, not over a period of hours. That in turn feeds through to a very, very weak capacity outlook. If I just give you some examples here from around Europe, major European airline groups, the Lufthansa Group has indicated they won't fly more than a quarter of their normal planned capacity in the last 3 months of this year, the last 3 months of the financial year for them. Similarly, IAG, which is the parent company of British Airways and Iberia, also Aer Lingus, they've indicated they will fly a maximum of 30% of their normally planned capacity in the last 3 months. And Ryanair today said that they would certainly not fly more than 40% of their planned winter capacity, possibly even less. They're ready and willing to cancel more flights in the event that more lockdowns or more reduction in demand occurs. What about the future travel mix? Well, there are many questions there. What we did see in the last few months when traffic showed signs of recovering was that friends and relations traffic, people who want to go and visit friends and family in different countries, are very much willing to travel if they have the opportunity. Similarly, I mentioned we had a short summer holiday surge in demand for Mediterranean destinations in Europe. That demand is there. There's certainly pent-up demand for leisure travel. But perhaps the biggest question for airlines, certainly those who work in the long-haul arena and who normally tap into the very profitable business class segment of the market, primarily supported by business travelers, have big questions to ask. The lovely seats here, the onboard product that goes with it, that is normally the choice of business travelers, those who want a bit of luxury and comfort, is very much in question right now. Of course, numerous companies throughout the world have cut back their business travel for reasons of health or budget currently. And I'm very much of the school of thought that believes this will not all come back. Any recovery that does take place will itself take time for business travel. But I believe in the era now of Zoom, Teams, Skype, online conferences, a certain percentage is not going to come back. But we've got to remember, many companies are not just looking to economize on budget, they're wanting to prove to the world they have green credentials. So what better way than actually to stop your executives flying as often as they were before? I think this is going to cause a major challenge for those airlines who do normally make a lot of profit from business travelers. They're going to really have to rework their business models entirely, or look for new customers to fill these business class seats. Certainly the premium leisure traffic already, some of which travels in business class, maybe that can be expanded. Perhaps we're going to see customers who in future will not be traveling for the reasons of simply being well rested or having time to work for a business trip, but do so for reasons of health, feeling of having more space, more distance on board. But that's all for the future. It's speculation. I still think the hit on this segment is going to be significant. What about aircraft type? Well, we've seen changes already since the crisis hit. Airlines have been grounding aircraft all over the world, and many of them have been retired. This slide from the airline industry body IATA shows how many aircraft were planned for delivery this year. Many of those have been at least deferred, in many cases cancelled. A lot of aircraft, as I suggested, have been grounded, but some have been retired. We see this massive acceleration on the chart on the right there from IATA, showing many more aircraft as a percentage of the total fleet being retired for good. And this next slide illustrates that perfectly. British Airways recently retired its entire fleet of 32 747 jumbo jets, very big aircraft. They happen to have a lot of business class seats too, so it ties in with the feeling of airlines about the loss of business traffic. These aircraft are now sitting rather forlornly in this picture, sitting awaiting their fate just to be turned into scrap aircraft in the picture, already having had their engines removed. I think what we're going to see in the future, as aircraft are replaced, is a move to smaller aircraft, even in the long-haul arena. In some cases, there will be smaller, narrow-bodied aircraft like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner or Airbus's A350. But now with improved technology, we'll see more aircraft going down to smaller types on long-haul services, such as the Airbus A321, LR and XLR, or Boeing 737 MAX, once that is restored to safe service. And Boeing themselves recently published what is known as a commercial market outlook. It's a 20-year forecast of demand for new aircraft, which they publish each year. They published it, not surprisingly, rather later this year, given the market conditions. And they show, of course, that demand for aircraft is going to fall. They see much weaker demand for new aircraft in the coming several years, over maybe a 5-year time frame, which is going to hit them and Airbus and other aircraft manufacturers significantly, who need that production line to be working the whole time. There's certainly going to be problems to deal with there and job losses through the supply chain. But when airlines do start to move again in ordering, a lot of that will be about replacement. A lot of the aircraft that have been retired now will be replaced. It will not be new aircraft in terms of extra aircraft coming into the fleet. And as I mentioned, Boeing also believes many of these new aircraft will be narrow-bodied rather than wide-bodied aircraft. But what is interesting in what Boeing said recently is they do expect, as we move further into the future, that the long-term growth trend will resume and will start to edge back towards where it otherwise would have been, maybe over this 20-year time period. The graph there on the right is a good indication of showing what happened before, for example, after crises such as 9/11, SARS, and the financial crisis, where demand blipped. We can see it's blipping very much more now of the COVID-19 crisis, but nevertheless, they expect that to recover back to some normality sometime in the future. What about airline business models? I think the crisis has generated questions about the composition of the industry, not just in terms of aircraft type or the volume of activity, but what kinds of airlines are going to survive for the future. This is likely to change as well. Hub carriers such as Air France, KLM, Lufthansa, British Airways, the large US carriers, and the Gulf carriers that operate large hubs, feeding passengers from one flight to another across their global networks. They've certainly been hit like everyone. The question of whether transfer traffic and people making connections is still going to be valid for the future, I think it will be. I think the volume may be lower, but many point-to-point markets, that's to say flying from city A to end in city B, are simply not big enough to justify flights in their own right. They can only be served by feeding passengers through a hub and providing a composite of customers onto one long-haul departure. So I think that is still going to be needed, albeit airlines are going to have to work harder to make it a very seamless, hassle and stress-free product, given that now we're all focusing on social distancing and concerns about hygiene in crowd situations. But the model will still be there in a different guise or different volume, I think. And as I mentioned, it's a lot of these hub airlines who are disposing of a very large aircraft like the 747 and indeed the A380. I think they're going to move to smaller aircraft, which itself will reduce the scale of hub operations. Now, in previous crises, we've seen low-cost carriers the winners, and I think the same is going to apply again. Why is that? Because they are innately airlines based on selling on price, and price tends to move people who would go if the ticket price is at an acceptably low level. They have a low cost base to support that. It's not simply a matter of offering low fares. They can ordinarily make money out of those low prices. And they tend to be very flexible and nimble and moving their aircraft around from one market to another, and certainly willing to exploit failure of other airlines or weakness of others. Ryanair commented on that today. They expect to take opportunities, and I'll give a few more comments on that as we come to the end of the presentation. I think it's a different story though for low-cost long-haul, which over recent years has tried to emulate the success of short-haul low-cost carriers in the long-haul market. Now, there's no doubt it's been very popular with customers. People have flocked onto Norwegian flights here in Europe or onto AirAsia flights in Asia, or Jetstar, for example, and a few other airlines. Equally, we've seen failures already of this business model, because being popular is not the same thing as being profitable. Now, the photo here, a perfect illustration of a challenge with Norwegian, the largest low-cost long-haul airline here in Europe, is currently seeing most of its long-haul 787 fleet grounded, indeed all of it, to be honest. And they indicated only a couple of weeks ago that they expect to dispose of about half of the 787 long-haul aircraft in their fleet, and they've cancelled all future orders running to about 100 aircraft, a mixture of the wide-body 787 and the narrow-body 737. So I think this is quite a challenged business model. Indeed, as I would say, an underestimate. It's a severely challenged business model. I don't know how well this is going to make it, if at all, for the future. Ultra long haul is worth mentioning. At the moment, it's quite a niche. Qantas had introduced a couple of years ago a non-stop Perth-London flight using the long-range capacity of the Boeing 787. Similarly, Singapore Airlines introduced a number of non-stop routes to US cities, including California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and over to New York, using a similar long-range capability and efficiency of the Airbus A350. Now, all these routes have gone into temporary abeyance with this crisis. They are very focused on premium customers to justify the extra amount of time that you need to use these aircraft for, typically 36 hours for a round trip from your departure point, compared to a 24-hour round trip on most long-haul flights. You need to be sure you're going to get the demand at the premium revenues to justify that commitment of aircraft, and indeed in terms of people needing extra flight crew and cabin crew. Qantas has said, though, that although they've stopped these flights right now, they do see opportunities for the future. They expect them to come back. Singapore Airlines is actually introducing in the next few weeks. New York is coming back into the operation of the ultra long haul segment, but it's not yet clear whether this is going to be a growing segment or whether it will remain something of a niche. It could be argued, reflecting on what I was just saying about hub carriers, that many people in the future maybe will look to make journeys without having to stop in a hub, and maybe prepared to pay a premium for that, the simple convenience of getting on it to your origin point and not getting off until you arrive on the other side of the world. So this is going to be an interesting model to monitor in the future airline environment, and very much dependent on advancing technology in aircraft for its ability to function. What about the recovery itself? How we're looking in terms of barriers and what kind of timescales? Well, the industry view is broadly this is going to be a recovery taking some years, about a period of 4 or 5 years up to about 2024, 2025. Of course, it's not precise. Nobody can put any particular mathematical equation to this and know the answer. There are just too many variables. But no doubt long-haul travel is going to be the hardest to see recover, given the additional complexities of crossing borders and different government policies. That, as I mentioned, is a particular challenge for those airlines who are long-haul focused, if they don't have any income coming in and they're not using their fleets. Of course, the ultimate goal would be to get a vaccine, but it's certainly not a certainty that we'll get a vaccine, or where we get it, how long it'll take to implement, and whether it becomes a broad and widespread fix to this challenge we're facing with the pandemic, with the coronavirus currently. The other challenge to recovery is the attitude and behavior of governments. I think the industry itself, airlines, airports, regulatory bodies are trying to work together, to work in unison to try to find solutions to get travel going again. But that's completely the opposite of what we're seeing with governments. Every government is doing its own thing. We have a cobweb of confusion around the world about what governments are doing in terms of border closures, quarantines, and views about testing for the virus and so on. And we need to see a much closer coordination there, and indeed a willingness of governments to work with the industry. The industry is rather being caught out, despite asking for a number of things to be done and putting forward constructive proposals. It's being caught out by governments springing surprises, quite late notice surprises about changes in travel regulations at the present time. It's as if governments have forgotten the very broad economic value of aviation, not just in terms of its own direct employment, but in terms of its support of tourism and the wider economy. We can't take a zero risk approach on this. We don't take a zero risk approach on anything else. We have to make sure that air travel is safe from a health point of view, just as we always have done in every other aspect of safety. But that does not mean a zero risk, which is unfortunately the rather black and white approach that we're seeing taken at the moment. There are some pragmatic measures that have been taken to help at the present time, to build confidence, to allow safe air travel, one of which of course relates to aircraft hygiene. And there's a lot of work going on across the industry, from manufacturers such as Boeing and Airbus, working with safety agencies, working with airlines, working with science to ensure that aircraft themselves are kept to the highest levels of cleanliness. One thing that people maybe don't know is that the air quality on planes is very good because it recirculates, or circulates fresh, we should say, every 2 or 3 minutes using HEPA hospital quality air filters. It's much, much better than many ground buildings or normal environments we would find ourselves in, such as homes or restaurants. There are other techniques being assessed to ensure that aircraft are clean, ultraviolet sterilization, for example, surfaces which themselves can kill or avoid the propagation of viruses, different sprays and disinfectants. It's complicated because different surfaces in aircraft, not least, for example, electronics on aircraft flight decks, are highly sensitive. So it's not a case of simply spraying on some kind of gel or taking a one-stranded approach. It has to be a multiple approach. Similarly, at airports, the same attention is being given to hygiene. The big challenge for airports is social distancing, because right now, when traffic is at a very, very low level, we're not having a problem in terms of capacity of social distancing. But in the future, as volumes recover, or indeed now at any peak times, we have to avoid a situation of queuing. Of course, there are many pressure points at airports, and that means that capacity can actually be reduced. Airports' physical capacity cannot be sustained at the levels it has been prior to the pandemic because of a need for social distancing. So inevitably, technology is going to have to come into play a role to speed up processes, to also address the issue of social distancing and hygiene. Certainly the idea of the touchless, the contactless journey is something that is already underway, and a lot more work has to be done on that. There's a lot of activity going on in the industry right now, and virus or no virus, this will change the way we travel in the future, with much more of our activity at airports linked around our mobile phones. It's a very interesting area, and I think ultimately we'll have some very positive results for the experience of going through airports. Similarly, the use of biometrics, using our own irises, our own face profile as our means of identity and avoiding having to touch, and also hopefully improving more accuracy, for example, at things like border control. Testing, for as long as we don't have a vaccine, is absolutely imperative to help bring the industry back to life, to facilitate aviation, to facilitate tourism, and this really needs to be pre-departure. Before people travel has to be the time when we undertake testing, but that itself is something that's been much talked about. The industry is certainly right to try to push this forward, but it is complex. There are different methods of testing, different scientific options, which I make no claim to have a detailed understanding of, but certainly it's apparent some have greater reliability than others, some are quite quick to implement, others take more time, and of course there's a cost involved as well in applying these different techniques. There's a question as well as to whether these tests should be done on the airport, which generally is going to be a challenge in terms of capacity and not easy to deliver, particularly at airports with less facilities, or whether they should be done preferably off airport but quite close to departure. The question being, how far in advance of departure? The closer to your travel time, the better in terms of getting that reliability. And as I mentioned, the question of cost, we have to pay for vaccines now ourselves. It's quite likely we're going to have to continue to pay for testing in the future. So as I draw to the close of my comments before I take your questions, are there any opportunities? Is it just a downward spiral, a world of gloom? I think not. But I think what's going to be required is a really dynamic and innovative approach, even to get the capacity that was already there restored to a limited extent, requires a level of courage, a relative level of risk for airlines to do, and certainly looking at new markets and understanding the shape and size of markets and travel for the future. It's going to require airlines to be quite dynamic in how they put capacity into the marketplace. It won't be a simple matter of having timetable changes twice a year. I think the next few years we're going to see far more volatility, far more flexibility and change in timetables in order to match demand to what the supply is that can be offered by airlines, because there's far more uncertainty that's going to be around for some time in the future. It really is going to be a case of trial and error. Similarly, so in terms of the products that airlines offer, I think there's going to be a need to test out different approaches. I suggested that maybe business class seats, for example, could be filled by leisure customers paying a premium or people who are concerned about health. Are we going to see an increased role, for example, in premium economy? Are there going to be other elements that people are prepared to pay for because they meet their particular needs of travel more effectively? And how are airlines going to sell? I think digitalization, which again is underway, really will be accelerating to fine-tune what airlines offer and to better match what customers are asking for. And perhaps the last slide in terms of this optimism makes the point that airlines who are out there already are taking these opportunities. Looking at the top left there, Ryanair said today very clearly they see many opportunities in the post-COVID world that they will be able to take where other airlines have failed or cut capacity back with aircraft groundings or retirements. And I'll be talking with Michael O'Leary next Tuesday at WTM and asking him about exactly this topic. Top right, we see JetBlue, the US low-cost carrier who equally has a very high-quality front-end product, the Mint lie-flat seat product. They too have talked about taking new opportunities. Even now, they're changing their approach to their planned network by adding leisure routes and opening up new markets across the US and associated leisure destinations. And next Wednesday, I'll be talking to Robin Hayes, the CEO of JetBlue, also as part of a WTM Aviation series, and discussing that with him. And we shouldn't forget a previous guest at WTM, Wizz Air, CEO Joseph Verardi, who we spoke to earlier this year in the ATM virtual and last year at WTM. Wizz Air has talked about waiting 10 years for the opportunity, as they put it, that this crisis provides them. They're adding new bases all over Europe. They're adding aircraft. They're trying out new routes. They see the opportunity to take territory from other airlines. So I think there will be opportunities out there for those who are not only brave enough to take them, but those who are best able to take them because they have the aircraft fleet means and they have the financial resources to battle through the challenging time we find ourselves in now. So I hope that gives you a flavour of where we are right now. This really is a movable situation. It's changing every day. I'm sure next time we present it will look different again, but I feel optimistic for this industry, which I personally have worked in for my whole working life. It's going to be challenging times for sure the next few years, but there's going to be a future, I believe, for those who are getting into the industry early on now. If they can get through this tough time, they're going to have very interesting careers ahead in reshaping this industry. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and very happy to take your questions and answer them as best I can. Thanks a lot.
Super. Well, thank you, John, for those fascinating points. We have had some questions coming in over that past 30 minutes there, but on behalf of all of us who are watching that, thank you for that very detailed and insightful presentation on a whole raft of things that are affecting the aviation industry. We'll start off then with a fairly broad question that's come in. You mentioned that the studies sort of show that it'll be 4 to 5 years before aviation might begin to recover. Do you have any insight into what that recovery might look like in terms of, are we going to be going back to 2019, or is this going to be a completely kind of new aviation future that's shaped in a different way out of this?
Well, as I was saying there, Sam, because none of us actually know, nobody's got either that expertise or even that crystal ball to truly tell. I think the only way that it would be comparable with 2019 is as and when we get back to a similar volume that we had in aviation around the world in 2019. But as I suggested, I don't think we're going to see the same players. Some airlines are going to disappear and others are going to shrink. Some are going to be eaten up by others. Even those that remain are going to have a different approach to business. There'll be newcomers who come along and we don't even know about as yet. I'm sure there are people around the world currently hatching business plans, thinking, what do customers want? The real entrepreneurs of the airline business. And of course, it's a great time to get hold of aircraft, very cheap. The manufacturers have plenty of capacity available. They're going to be good second-hand aircraft in the marketplace. So to start off with a very, very low cost base, and particularly if you happen to be very entrepreneurial and very digitally focused, I think that's going to be the potent combination. Yeah. But those questions that I put about, business class, for example, and what cabins people travel in and what kind of things we look for, I think all that's in a melting pot right now. And it's going to be perhaps scary on the one hand and fascinating on the other to see how that pans out.
Exactly. And moving on to one of the big airline and aviation stories that's come out over the last few months in particular is around the AIG group, and particularly British Airways. Obviously, Alex Cruz stepping down from his role around a month ago there. What's the future for a big legacy carrier like British Airways? Obviously, AIG, also Iberia and Aer Lingus as part of that as well. Is this a very seminal moment for that organisation? We're seeing a lot of change over this past year, and you mentioned that the 747s are going out of service as well. Do you think this is going to be a very pivotal moment for particularly British Airways?
I think it is a pivotal moment. What I would say, having studied IAG's performance since it was founded, about 9 years ago, and indeed having a long way back worked for British Airways and looked at subsequent managements over the years, I think they've always been very dynamic. Now, they got a lot of difficult press this summer from conflict with their unions about job losses, many accusations made that they were exploiting this in the eyes of some kind of temporary crisis. I personally don't believe, and hopefully my slides have illustrated why, that this is not a temporary crisis. This is going to be a major structural change for the industry. And when we hear about airlines burning through millions of pounds, dollars, euros, whatever currency you want, an hour right now, and large numbers of aircraft grounded, particularly long haul, which of course is the case for British Airways, with the vast majority of their operation being long haul, I think they've had no choice but to look over the abyss, as it were, and try to work out how do they need to change. Well, change number one is to make sure you've got money in the bank. But some airlines have had bailouts from governments, even those, some of that cash is burning through already. I think I was reading KLM has received some support from the Dutch government, has burned through, I think it was about a third of what they've received already in a matter of a month or so since that was injected. So that shows the magnitude of a challenge. Now, BA has not been shy of making product changes in the past, which some people have not been happy about. But I think the evidence has been that their load factors have been very high, their financial results have been very strong, and customer appreciation has broadly still been there. The irony was they were in a big period of reinvestment of new aircraft and indeed upgraded product, particularly the high-end product, business class, was very much being rejuvenated significantly. And I think the world has now changed around them. But I would expect the management to take that same approach and try to look ahead. And it might not seem obvious right now that that's the right thing to do. But personally, I think only airlines who are willing to, if you like, think the unthinkable and front up the big challenges are the ones who are ultimately going to make it and then offer the best stability both to their members of staff, to customers traveling, and indeed to shareholders.
Super. And we'll move on to another question in a second. I just want to remind everybody who's tuning in today, if you do have a question for John, if you head to the top right-hand corner of your screen, you can submit some questions through to us, and we'll hopefully have time to come on to those. But we do have loads of questions already, John, and this is also one maybe tying into that sort of British Airways UK focus here. The person asks, how concerned are you about Brexit, negotiated deal or not, that's coming in around 70 days' time in parallel with the ongoing COVID-19 crisis as well? What does that mean in broad strokes, really, for the British aviation industry?
Well, I think it certainly complicates things for the industry. Most people in the airline industry have concerns about the consequences of Brexit. Now, it's been around the corner for a long time, and certainly that corner is now very close. Of course, the UK has already officially left the EU. It's just coming towards the end of this transition period. What it means is that airlines tried to be prepared. Airlines that were UK licensed went out and got themselves other operating licenses where they could to make sure that they could still operate in the EU. And similarly, airlines that were maybe EU based, for example, Ryanair and Wizz have also obtained licenses in the UK. Industry bodies have been very much lobbying governments and officials in the EU and of course in the UK as well to protect what we already have. I mean, one thing that has happened under the EU open skies is that there's been a lot more competition for air services throughout Europe from all member states to the benefit of consumers, both in terms of price levels. And sometimes we complain about some of those airlines who brought the lowest prices like Ryanair, but we've got to remember, indeed maybe some people don't remember, that many routes were not served in the past, and certainly prices were not as affordable as they've become recently. So I think all airlines are trying to protect that. And again, the whole challenge of the jobs which aviation represents directly and indirectly. So it's a case of watch your space, but it is really in the interest of politicians on both sides to protect at least the same ease of operations that we have now, because of the very significant economic benefit of the airline business.
Exactly. And a last question on this sort of topic of broader airlines in general. We saw right at the start of the pandemic, part of the reason Air France, KLM, and particularly the Air France side of things got a government bailout is because they committed to this plan of reducing routes, or even indeed scrapping routes that could be reached by TGV in France, for instance. Do you think that some other countries are going to follow that sort of logic and bring in sustainability clauses into their bailouts or their support for national carriers?
It's certainly possible. I mean, we've seen Lufthansa, for example, has received government support, not only in Germany, but from other countries where Lufthansa has stakes, majority stakes in airlines, for example, in Austria. And if I remember rightly, in Austria, they also, from a political point of view, were looking to stop certain what they regard as very short haul flights, or to have minimum prices put in place to try to discourage people traveling at very low prices. Now, you can argue that both ways. If the seats are empty, it's better for airlines to offer them and fill them up. Equally, they have to compete with surface transport such as trains and buses, so they have to have freedom of pricing. But I think the question of the environment, there's no doubt it had already risen rightly to the top of the agenda before this crisis hit. And I'm a believer that aviation has to play its part. I think one thing, ironically, is that with the very rapid retirement of older aircraft, I mentioned, of course, the 747 in British Airways fleet, and similarly, there are other airlines who've done the same thing with that aircraft, or other types such as the Airbus A340, or a lot of short-haul aircraft in the USA that have been retired. Obviously, short term, it means aviation capacity is going to be down significantly anyway. That has a direct correlation, of course, with emissions. But when replacement takes place, and it was underway, we're seeing many more efficient aircraft with much lower emissions than predecessor aircraft. But what I would really hope happens now, I cannot say that I'm optimistic that it will, but it should be that politicians and governments work with the industry right now to help the industry to really move forward with its green credentials. So when work is going on biofuels, for example, hydrogen-powered aircraft, electric-powered aircraft, governments should see the value of investing in those pieces of research, because it's not just a case of helping the industry. It's not in any way to help the industry for the sake of it. It's to help the industry so that it can deliver to the economy as a whole. So the government should take that proactive approach. And something else the industry has been asking for a long time is to have a much more efficient air traffic control system. That's a challenge here in Europe. It's a challenge in the USA. It's a challenge in the Middle East. And I'm sure in many other parts of the world. If governments invest in better air traffic control procedures at a stroke overnight with the implementation of new technology there, you can cut emissions today dramatically, instead of aircraft having to follow indirect routings or circling around waiting to land at airports. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but there's no use if politicians just point the finger at the industry. They need to work proactively and decisively with the industry. Now is the ideal time to do it, while we have this period of very much reduced activity and demand.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a theme that runs through, I mean, all of the discussions we're having as part of Travel Week and as part of WTM next week is that idea of this is a moment to think and use this as a catalyst for change in the future to make a better travel industry, get rid of those things that are causing blockages in air traffic control, for instance, and really sort of innovate into the future. Let's move on now a little bit towards perhaps more of the customer side of things, or the individual traveller experience through aviation. A question just coming from the audience here is, do you think a potential introduction of a vaccine certificate will have an influence on travel insurance in various countries, if that was brought in as a sort of mark of safety, for instance? Do you think that's going to restore confidence really in the industry, as well as provide sort of an impact on insurance too?
Well, I think it will be a very positive step. And as I suggested, particularly the airport environment, the more we can move into a technology assisted environment. For example, having a kind of a health passport on your phone and using biometric data and linking in all your medical certification with your personal credentials that are needed for travel in a way that cannot be interfered with, for example, with false documentation, and can be accessed by every relevant regulatory authority. That has got to be helpful. And it's also got to make it more speedy, because documents get lost, people forget to bring them to the airport, they lose them somewhere. Having something on your phone or that can be brought up quickly out of a database that shows you definitely have that health authorization, that's got to be positive. I mean, we have many situations already where to enter a country, you have to show that you've got vaccinations, and people had books of vaccination certificates in the past that were more regularly looked at than today. So this has got to be positive. What effect that has on insurance, I'm not expert enough to say, but I would guess for the insurance industry, anything that reduces their risk ought to be a positive thing in terms of the premiums they're able to charge.
Exactly. And back on that idea of the consumer, another question that's just coming from the audience is, do you think that passengers will increasingly look to book more last minute if we are going to be using sort of tests as a means to travel, a COVID test, sorry, as a means to travel? Do you think that's going to become much more of a last minute booking kind of phenomenon around the industry? People getting their test and saying, right, okay, I'm good now, 72 hours before we go, I'll book my flight.
It is a challenge for sure, and it's not one that there's a clear solution to, because people, of course, would prefer, generally speaking, to book early, especially on perhaps the once a year big holiday. You'd like to know you've got that sorted out months in advance, not a matter of days in advance, given all the elements of putting together a trip, or indeed for that matter a business trip, but certainly for a holiday. We've had a relatively late market for some aspects of short-haul travel, perhaps quick trips away for a weekend and so on. And of course, that has accelerated, as I said in the presentation right now. But we do need to find a way to allow people to move it back earlier, one for the level of stress reduction in making your own plans, and the other from a point of view of airlines being better able to plan. You know, when we've seen airlines criticised recently when quarantines have been brought in at short notice, and some media have maybe argued, well, airlines put their prices up because that quarantine came in. It's probably simply an example that when everything happens at the last minute, you have precious little time, if any, to react and change. So if an airline is operating one flight from, let's say, Paris to London, and the quarantine comes in the day before, the flight's probably already very full. And so the last few seats ordinarily go at higher prices. It's not that they deliberately put prices up. But if you have people booking earlier, you can observe that your flight is filling, and you can either look to put a larger aircraft on, or you can put more flights on, but you need a decent lead time. So I think actually this idea of having a health certificate or that type of pragmatic measure is never going to be as good as having a vaccine. If we're constantly having to live with certain elements of proving things at the last minute, it just indicates that we're going to have a more challenging world for some time forward.
Yeah, exactly. And just a reminder to anybody who is actually listening, if you do have any more questions at all, we have about 15 minutes left here with John, so do feel free to send those over to us. A slightly different question here now, and you brought it up in your talk, and it's just come through on the feed. The Boeing 737 MAX, that was the big aviation story for quite a lot of 2019, and indeed rumbled on through into 2020. What's the current status with that? And what's your feeling when it comes to people feeling confident to travel on it? If they see that their airline is a Boeing 737 MAX, is that going to reduce confidence?
Well, it looks like the aircraft could well be cleared to come back to service by the end of the year. The European authorities, EASA, have already indicated that they are now happy with the work that has been done to bring that aircraft to a high level and acceptable level of safety after the two tragic accidents. They are asking for more work to be done to further strengthen that, even as and when the aircraft does come back to service. I think similarly, the regulator in the USA, the FAA, is close to giving a green light too. It'll take time to get these aircraft back into service. There were hundreds already built and delivered to airlines, and hundreds more manufactured, ready for delivery prior to the grounding, which is perhaps amazingly about 18 months ago now.
Yeah.
And airlines, I think, are very conscious that they will have to be working their utmost to give us all a sense of confidence. I visited Boeing just under a year ago, last December, and even then they had no idea the grounding was going to last as long as it has, but they knew there was a lot of work to do on confidence, not only for us, the traveling public, but if we think about it, the pilots who fly these planes, the cabin crew who work on these planes, they have to be confident too. So there's been a lot of dialogue with those kind of groups to ensure confidence is there. And I think the media spotlight will be on the aircraft when it comes back. And even minor day-to-day incidents which occur as a normality in air travel with all aircraft will be focused on, and will be linkages made with what type of aircraft it is. But I think this has got to have been such a dramatic lesson to Boeing, as if it wasn't already quite clear that safety has to be paramount and preeminent above anything. It was an indication just how quickly trust can be lost, and the massive price that's been paid, in addition to the lives that were lost in the two accidents. The price has been paid for the manufacturer and the industry as a whole, where aircraft have had to be grounded and flights not operated. So yes, we're going to watch that one very closely as the aircraft come back. But we should all be confident when the regulators have gone over the work that's been done with extreme scrutiny. And I think more questions are willing to be asked now about aircraft safety when aircraft are being designed and built than perhaps had become the case. There'd been a willingness to maybe accept that if one or two regulators, particularly the Federal Aviation Authority in the States, had given the green light that the rest of the world did. So again, along with this COVID crisis, I think the crisis that came from the grounding of the 737 means there's going to be much more scrutiny around the world in future safety for aircraft types.
Exactly. And you mentioned in your talk, actually, the Boeing 737 MAX is part of a kind of new form of airline, these long distance but smaller single aisle airlines.
That's right.
You suspect that airplanes such as the 737 MAX or the Airbus A320 XLR, like you mentioned in the talk, do we think that bigger carriers are going to end up taking up these airplanes in particular to replace their big fleets of 747s and A380s that are proving unnecessary really at the moment? Could we see these kind of legacy carriers taking on planes like that?
I think so. I mean, these airlines were going to downsize progressively anyway, albeit not immediately. I mean, the A380, which is bigger than the 747 and a lot younger, was of course expected to be around with many airlines for the next 20 plus years. That's not as clear now. Perhaps Emirates is an exception to that. Yeah. But we've seen some of the European carriers like Air France and Lufthansa standing down permanently their A380s, along with those airlines taking out 747s. So they were already moving down to aircraft of the size of the A350 and 787. But as we see these, as you said, narrow-bodied aircraft with long-range capability coming into widespread service, particularly the Airbus 321 LR and XLR, given what is happening around us, I think there'll be a lot of work going on in airline fleet planning and network planning teams right now, evaluating what if scenarios. If the market is smaller, how much should we focus on these smaller planes? I mean, Aer Lingus, for example, which is already part of the IAG group, has already taken delivery of some of these Airbus 321 LRs and will get XLRs. They were already expanding their North Atlantic operations using these narrow-bodied planes. British Airways has them on order. British Airways and IAG as a whole has a memorandum of understanding, not yet confirmed into a full order, with Boeing for 200 MAXes. Now, the original idea was they would replace other short-haul aircraft in the fleets of those airlines in the IAG group. But in this situation, I think you're right. We're going to see these airlines also looking at flying more small aircraft on long-haul flights. And perhaps, as I said, the hub structure will change, and there might be a larger number of routes with small amounts of capacity and also smaller amounts of feed bringing customers onto those planes. But it won't be the preserve of, for example, low-cost carriers to get these aircraft and put onto long-haul flights. That's for sure.
Exactly. And a question that's just come in from the audience, and thank you to all of those who have been sending them through. It's the classic thorny question, John, when it comes to aviation and airlines. What are your views on the latest UK lockdown measures where international travel is not permitted? Should airlines refund their customers and travel partners? This issue of refunds has been so central to so many of the aviation stories over the past, well, 8 months or so now. What is your opinion on that?
Well, first of all, the immediate challenge that airlines have faced is that, of course, if they're not generating revenues, it doesn't mean we're not generating cost. Airlines are extremely costly machines, even in hibernation. This is why I'm personally convinced we're going to see some failures this winter. It's why governments have had to put money into airlines. One thing airlines have had at the beginning of this crisis is the money of those people who've already booked tickets. Yeah. Now, I think what airlines have tried to do, and perhaps haven't always communicated as clearly as would be desirable in some cases, is they've offered people the chance to use the credit on those tickets, either to rebook for a different date when they can travel or to have travel credit. Some airlines like Emirates have offered credit for up to 2 years ahead. So that way they don't have to give back precious liquidity, which the irony being, giving back your liquidity, giving back the cash you've already got, could tip the airline over the edge. And then there's no airline. And then there's no refunds, no future travel, nothing. So it's a delicate balance. But I have heard Michael O'Leary in the media today with Ryanair results just being out this morning, saying they've spent 1.5 billion euros on refunds, and they have refunded the majority of people already. So it's a delicate one because the crisis is out with their control. Of course, if you're booked to travel, you probably do want to get a refund if you can. But I think for many people, provided it's framed in the right way, having travel credit is also an acceptable way of addressing the issue. I think the other challenge is if you book very low price tickets, they're normally covered in restrictions anyway. But if you don't travel, and in the event that a flight operates, then that was arguably more under your control whether you traveled or not, and airlines are not obliged to give money back. So it's a no-win situation. I think what I see is that most airlines have been giving refunds, albeit there's certainly been one or two fights around between customers and airlines, but we have to understand the balance between survival and giving money back.
Of course. It ties in quite nicely to this question that's just come in, actually. What's the future of loyalty schemes within airlines? How will airlines cope if they sort of run out of ability to give out points? And does that whole point system need a rethink in this new COVID world? You mentioned, obviously, that refunds have been sort of pushed forward, or people being encouraged to rebook for future months, next year even, or 2 years like Emirates. We've also seen airlines do that with their loyalty schemes, say, right, well, your points don't run out at the end of 2020 that you accrued, they're rolled forward. Are we likely to see similar things with that, or indeed a whole rethink of that industry?
I think, as with everything in the industry, it's an opportunity to rethink the methodology of loyalty programs. They have been widely used, I would say broadly widely appreciated by customers. And of course, airlines have shown flexibility by keeping people's points valid for longer periods of time, or if they've reached high levels of status, those levels of status have been extended forward in some cases by a year or 2 years. But there are costs as well to running a loyalty scheme, and there's no point to spend the cost if it isn't seen as valuable to customers. Equally, they have been salvations to airlines. Some airlines have sold large amounts of loyalty points to partners. For example, again, IAG has sold a large number of advanced points to American Express. It's actually generated more cash for the airlines at a time when they need it. So I think it's a state of flux. I don't think they will disappear. I think they will be reviewed. And in the short term, it's a matter of trying to keep people on board by giving us flexibility in terms of when points are valid for and can be redeemed on flights.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do one last question, and then I'll have a quick chat with you about what's coming up next week, obviously, as part of WTM Virtual. And this is a great question to end on, so thank you to whoever sent this in. Is there an example of a country or government that is coordinating well with its tourism industry and its aviation industry? Is there one, from your professional opinion, that you've seen where you think, yes, this is a model to move forward? Because as you mentioned, there has been so many sticking points in so many countries when it comes to this issue.
I can't say that I can bring to mind really the model example. I mean, everybody's learning. I mean, it's easy to say, as I did, about those who are not cooperating and coordinating. But I mean, one that I know about a little more, and it's partisan for that reason. One of my clients, I work with the Icelandic Airport Authority, and I certainly see there that there was a recognition, as there was when we had the financial crisis and the volcanic eruption, of just how important tourism is to Iceland. So certainly there, the airport and the tourism authority are very proactive in trying to make sure that they are working to encourage airlines to come back when they can, that the tourism authorities have a clear message to give confidence to customers to come back and travel to Iceland in the future. But we're not at that point yet. I mean, even Iceland, many people would like to go there because, you know, it's a country that is seen as having a lot of wide open space. I mean, the tourism authority did run a campaign along the lines of come and have a scream in Iceland, scream out in the open where nobody hears you, to let out your tensions. I mean, it was a great campaign. Unfortunately, again, Iceland, as with other countries, is caught up in the challenge of quarantine. So although they saw a resurgence of traffic for a couple of months in July, August, changes in their own quarantine requirements then somewhat stifled that. But I think it's an example, and I stress it's something I'm closer to because it is one of my clients that I'm talking about, where they are ready to do a number of positive things, not just on the tourism front, but from the airport point of view with airlines at that right moment, because we know pent-up demand is there, people want to fly again, and I think lessons could be learned from that. And I know one airline, at least, who told me they've shown examples of what had been done in Iceland themselves to other tourist boards.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. And like you say, it is that thing of everybody in the industry listening to one another and working out a collective solution to that. We've got a few minutes left, so John, let's just move on to, because obviously this isn't the only thing that you're doing this autumn for WTM. Next week you are interviewing both Michael O'Leary of Ryanair and then Robin Hayes of JetBlue. As you alluded to in your presentation, two really fascinating examples in the aviation industry of the moment of carriers that could be ready to spring back quickly. What are you particularly looking forward to, and what do you think is going to be interesting about those two interviews next week?
Well, both airlines have just published their financial results in the last few days. Ryanair, in fact, today. They're very different airlines. Ryanair, of course, is the giant here in Europe in the low-cost arena. Michael O'Leary has been at the helm of that company for many years, and whether you love him or hate him, he has views, and I think at least interesting views, you could say, on pretty well every relevant topic of the industry and very forthright in putting them forward. So I'm hoping to have a lively discussion. I hope not a destructive discussion, because there's a lot to learn from what Ryanair has done and what Ryanair is saying now about getting things back on the right road to recovery. They certainly see opportunities themselves. They're growing as a business anyway, and they're waiting to get deliveries of the Boeing 737 MAX that we're just talking about. They are always very aware where there is weakness around the map and where they can jump in and fill the gap that somebody else is no longer occupying. So to talk about that, to talk about the changing landscape, I'm interested to hear about his views on other airlines and the shape of the industry. Ryanair themselves have often been a leader in pushing forward the approach of the particular business model that they offer to customers. Equally, Michael O'Leary himself has made changes that he felt possibly he didn't believe in, but was convinced to believe, and changed things within Ryanair's model based on what he's seen working elsewhere. So that's going to be very interesting. JetBlue will be very well known to any American members of the audience. Is a major low-cost carrier in the US, particularly from its origins in the US Northeast out of Boston and New York. I'm fascinated here and there what they have done to adapt quickly to this crisis. They've gained a lot of plaudits for how they've handled customer service aspects of this crisis. And again, looking towards next year, they've already put out a few teasers about their plans to come with their product transatlantic, to come into London amongst other gateways with their, again, long-range Airbus 321s, and maybe challenge airlines who are already here. Now, when they talked about doing it a year or so ago, it looked like it was maybe a big challenge. They talked about offering lower prices for business class seats because they see the prices in their eyes as being very, very high across the Atlantic in the front end cabins. But maybe their moment couldn't have come more appropriately with this crisis when people are looking at budgets, maybe more questioning of spending a lot of money on a business class seat, but still wanting that comfort. So there's a lot to ask Robin about. And they're an airline who, as I said, fly a lot domestically. They're also making changes in their own fleet there, their own digitalization of the business. So I think a lot of things I'd like to discuss there and hopefully get some enlightenment in the process next week.
Fantastic. Well, we're looking forward to that. And thank you, John, for enlightening all of us today on many of the things facing the aviation industry.
Thank you, Sam. And thanks to the audience for sticking with us as well.
That's all right. This session will be on demand for the entirety of London Travel Week Virtual and WTM Virtual, so you can check back in to rediscover any of John's insights. We look forward to those sessions next week. And all that remains for me to say is thank you very much, John, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Enjoy the rest of London Travel Week Virtual.